Hello there, person that's probably concerned about my well-being due to my lacking upload schedule. So I'm finally getting around that movie review idea that I was going to do back, let's say, about a year ago. I've always wanted to start this subsection of the channel with superhero movies, as they are one of my favorite genres of film. Why? Because I don't know, I find them very interesting and I like sharing my thoughts about them. There might be occasions where I do review quote-unquote real movies, I guess you can say, but I'm going to stick with this idea for now. As you might know already, there have been many of these superhero movies released in the past century, and my goal is to review every single one that I possibly could. So how am I going to embark on this little journey I've been wanting to plan? Well, let's start off with my favorite superhero character, and that's Spider-Man, of course. Spider-Man has been my favorite superhero since I was a child, which this kind of applies to almost everyone who loves him nowadays. I've had all the classic Toy Biz action figures that have been released around the time, and of course, like many other Spider-Man fans around the time, I also watched the 1994 cartoon show, which is still one of my favorite adaptations till this day. There is no doubt that he is one of the most beloved characters in fiction, but his jump to the big screen, as well as his journey on the big screen, proved to be quite the bitch. I should never ad-lib for anything ever again. It took over 2 decades and many filmmakers and studios to bring this character to life. There was going to be a Spider-Man movie that involved Peter Parker turning into a real spider because the filmmakers didn't know who Spider-Man was at the time. And then another movie by Canon Films that I guess you can say was more comic accurate, which got canceled because of bankruptcy, and then there was some raunchy and questionable version of Spider-Man that was being done by James Cameron. I don't know, it's just all complicated. That I could say that deserves a video on its own, but I have a feeling that many other people have already documented on it, so I'm not gonna do that here. This would all lead up to Marvel's bankruptcy in '96. But they would eventually get back on their feet when Toy Biz bought the Marvel toy rights. This would also lead to Marvel executives giving the film rights to certain film studios. For Spider-Man, Sony Pictures was the studio that got the character rights, and then they went through many film directors to see who would be the perfect choice for the character. After many disinterests, they finally settled onto the iconic horror director Sam Raimi, who had a passion for comic book characters and comic books as a whole. They took a lot of time trying to find their Spider-Man, including James Franco, who would eventually end up playing Peter Parker's best friend Harry Osborn in the final film. Of course, they ended up with Tobey Maguire, who was chosen for his role in the Cider House Rules. Kirsten Dunst was chosen to play Mary Jane Watson because Tobey Maguire was casted, I couldn't find anything about it, to be honest. After many weird casting choices for the main antagonist, including Nicolas Cage, Willem Dafoe was the final casting choice for the Green Goblin, due to his interest in the script, which is the exact reason why Tobey Maguire was interested. David Koepp was hired to screenwrite the film, and the script met many changes throughout development. Earlier drafts of the film included Dr. Otto Octavius as Norman Osborn's assistant at Oscorp. An experiment would go wrong at Oscorp, which would cause both of them to become their respective villains. As you might have guessed, Otto was pushed to Spider-Man 2 due to Raimi wanting Norman to have a closer bond with his son. As for the special effects, John Dykstra, the special effects artist of the film, expressed how much of a difficult task it was to get Spider-Man working on the big screen. They studied a lot of classic Spider-Man poses to see what would work on the big screen and appeal to the fans. As for Spidey's costume, Raimi stated that he didn't want to reinvent the Spider-Man costume, but rather make it appealing and modern while still looking classic. The Green Goblin's costume, however, went through a drastic change. They had originally tested an animatronic mask for the Green Goblin, which looked cool, but was scrapped due to Willem Dafoe stating that it wasn't comfortable. Peter Parker was supposed to have mechanical web shooters just like in the comics, which was featured in concept art, sculpted models, early teaser trailers, and even movie mistakes, though they were scrapped in favor of organic webbing. This was due to Sam Raimi thinking mechanical web shooters were unbelievable for a poor teenager, which honestly I agree with, personally. This was actually an idea that was lifted from James Cameron's script. Our very first glimpse of what would become Sam Raimi's Spider-Man was a teaser trailer released in theaters around July 2001. I'm gonna leave you to figure out the reason why this trailer was pulled from theaters.
Okay, so originally I was going to go over the plot of the movie, but then I realized how long the video was getting, and I also realized that most people on this planet have already seen this movie, so I'm just gonna cut to the post-release section and my review. So yeah, there we go.
The movie released in the US on May 3rd, 2002, and met with both critical and financial success. It was the first movie to gross over $100 million within its opening weekend, and had a total gross of over $800 million. This was very impressive, mostly because at the time X-Men had only reached over 300 million, and Blade only had over 100 million. It was basically the first ever superhero movie that made it even remotely close to $1 billion. Of course, this isn't that impressive nowadays, since making $1 billion is pretty much like a piece of cake for Marvel to do. But back then, nothing got close other than Spider-Man. Of course, the fans also loved it, which I think was pretty much a difficult task to do as well back in the day. Even till this day, fans still love the movie, with Stan Lee himself even saying at one point that it was his favorite superhero movie.
Yeah, Blake, I think my favorite comic book movie was the first one that was such a hit, the first Spider-Man. And after that, everything else seemed easy.
Though the film has met some criticism over the years, mostly due to the fact that it is dated. And to an extent, I agree. The CG effects obviously don't age well in certain areas, and the soundtrack has Chad Kroeger from Nickelback, as well as Sum 41 and Macy Gray. It's easy to say that those artists don't make the top charts anymore. Though these things don't really take away from the movie for me. If anything, they add a bit of charm to the movie. In fact, this applies to a lot of films that are dated, in my opinion. Another thing this movie gets criticized for is its cheesiness factor, and they have the right to not like that. It's kind of a personal thing. Once again, this is not an issue that I have, and if anything, I like this kind of stuff. I actually adore the camp this movie offers because it gives the film more life and distinction among other comic book movies. And the film isn't all camp. There's still a lot of emotional scenes and pretty intense action and some romance as well. To a degree, it's actually pretty grounded, despite, all the campy stuff in it. Though it doesn't really take itself too seriously. Like, it's serious when it needs to be, and whenever it's goofy, it fully embraces it. There are definitely a couple comic book films that came before and after it that definitely goes overboard with its cheesiness, but this movie doesn't. For the most part, the movie has a pretty tight script, though there are some issues with it, like how Peter Parker accidentally discovers his powers in the cafeteria, and how no one really suspects that he's Spider-Man later on in the movie, which is definitely a weak part, but everything else pretty much ties within itself pretty well. I also really like the pacing in this movie. It bounces back and forth between Peter and Norman. It's demonstrating how one becomes the hero and then the other one comes the villain, back and forth until they both meet together. The movie also does a pretty good job at telling Spider-Man's origin story, with some minor alterations such as the radioactive spider. The radioactive spider is already radioactive, while in the comic books it meets up with a radioactive ray, which makes it become radioactive. I very much prefer this version of Spider-Man's origin over the Amazing Spider-Man one. I think the Amazing Spider-Man one is kind of complicated, but I'll get to that movie later on.
But Daddy didn't give you enough milk money today?
It's 2 cents. We're talking about 2 cents.
Just step aside, kid.
This movie's action scenes are pretty fun, and action-packed, I guess you can say. But I think choreography-wise, they're kind of weak. Like, it's on par with a Power Rangers fight scene. It kind of just looks like two action figures being slammed against each other. I definitely think choreography-wise, the action scenes throughout the Spider-Man trilogy have gotten better and more exhilarating. That being said, I really do admire all of the practical effects and the pyrotechnics used for the explosions and the fire. The one fight scene that is really good is the final fight between Spider-Man and Green Goblin in the abandoned hospital. This is a very tense and emotional fight right here. Peter and Norman were once like father and son, and he really supported Peter. So seeing both of them fight to the death is very heart-wrenching. It's also really dark. Like, when you compare it to the rest of the movie is like fun and lighthearted, but this is really dark and bloody. It's pretty cool. At the time, this was probably the most violent and bloody a superhero movie could be, at least for a rated PG-13, until Avengers Endgame came out, and, you know, Thanos' head gets chopped off, and now it's like not really a big deal. But still, at the time, it was pretty amazing. Danny Elfman's score is probably one of the most iconic superhero movie scores ever, and is probably most people's go-to Spider-Man theme, excluding the 67 theme, of course, because that one's obvious. The score perfectly expresses every single emotion conveyed throughout the movie, whether it be like an emotional cue, or like an evil cue for the villain, or heroic, or for the action scenes. This is just a flawless score in my opinion. There's not a single track throughout the 40 tracks in the complete score release that I really even remotely dislike. Another sort of small scale thing that I want to touch on is the title sequence. The title sequence was done by Kyle Cooper of Prologue Films and has done multiple work throughout Hollywood, but I think Spider-Man is one of his most notable works. This is an amazing title sequence. The letters being attached to the webbing in the CGI Spidey that occasionally appears on screen gives this entire sequence life and flair, and the score really benefits it. It's a bit lengthy, but I think it goes off hard. In terms of the Spider-Man movies, all three of these title sequences remain unmatched in my opinion. Like I said, the special effects in this movie don't really hold up well in certain areas, but there are certain moments in this movie that do still look good to this day. Examples would be whether it be a swinging scene, or that one scene where he's fighting the Green Goblin in the burning building and he's dodging the razor bats. As for my thoughts on the cast and characters, Tobey Maguire is probably the best fit for Peter Parker in my opinion. He has his nerdy look and he pulls off the nerdy personality well. I do think he's a bit on the soft side, as Peter in the comics seems to be a bit more cocky, but it doesn't really bother me too much. Kirsten Dunst pulls off a perfect look for Mary Jane, and I think, at least in this movie, she's pretty good. As the movies progress, she gets a bit more miserable for my taste, but here she seems to be a bit more likable. Well, minus the screaming. James Franco I didn't feel was the most noteworthy performance, and he's usually a good actor, and in this movie he's not bad either. He pulls off the angsty, miserable teen feel pretty nicely when he's ragged on by his father. Willem Dafoe makes the perfect choice for a disappointed father figure, a proud father figure, and a psychopathic serial killer. He pretty much chews up the scenes he's in when he's the Green Goblin. A lot of people seem to not get the motivation of the Green Goblin, which to a degree I see where they're coming from. He accomplishes what he needed to do, which was killing the Oscorp board members. Though he still acts maniacal and wants to take over the entire city. There is an explanation for that, and that's because the goblin gas, or whatever you call it, the serum, whatever, the performance enhancers, or whatever they're called, they cause violence, aggression, and insanity. So the serum kind of takes over his mind later on, which makes him become a maniac. Though I'll admit, some of this does sound pretty cliche, but I think Dafoe's performance pretty much makes up for it. The absolute worst I have to say about his character is that it's kind of a shame that they threw a motorcycle helmet on him. Cliff Robertson and Rosemary Harris, I think, remain as the definitive castings for Peter's uncle and aunt. Sally Field from the Amazing Spider-Man movies was pretty great too, and kind of is a competition to Rosemary Harris's Aunt May to a degree. Though I don't really care about Uncle Ben in that movie, I don't really care that much to the point I already forgot the actor's name. And then there's also that Aunt May that we don't talk about. Then there's J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson.
Oh, what is he, shy? If we can get a picture of Julia Roberts in a thong, we can certainly get a picture of this weirdo.
One set of side characters I don't think get as much love as they should is the Daily Bugle cast, consisting of Robbie Robertson, Betty Brant, and Hoffman, played by Sam Raimi's brother Ted Raimi. The way they interact with each other and Jameson is so fun and entertaining, and it goes throughout the entire trilogy as well, and it's pretty damn great every single time.
You want a staff job, and you want a staff job. Anybody care about what I want?
I do.
Shut up. Get out.
One last set of characters I'd like to touch on are the New York citizens in the movie. Specifically in the scene at the end of the movie where the Green Goblin is fighting Spider-Man on the bridge and the New Yorkers are defending Spider-Man by throwing trash at the Green Goblin. The things that the New Yorkers say at the Green Goblin is still very heartwarming to me, and it just proves how great of characters they are, and they're willing to defend their hero. This stuff is pretty damn cool, and it's unfortunate that you don't really see this stuff happening in Spider-Man movies anymore. Spider-Man is a pretty good movie. It isn't perfect on any stretch of the imagination, and neither are the next two movies in the trilogy, but it's an extremely enjoyable film with a ton of heart and passion behind it. You can't really condemn all of the hard work the filmmakers put into this movie. Not at all does this movie feel cheap, cash grabby, lifeless, or boring to me. Sam Raimi wanted to make a movie that anyone could love, whether it be a moviegoer, a comic book fan, and so on. And to how many people think of it, I think he nailed just that. I'm 100% sure this goes out for a lot of people, but this was my first introduction to the character, superheroes, movies, and just pop culture in general. So of course I'm gonna love the hell out of this movie, as well as the other two in the trilogy. Sorry this video took a little longer than expected to get out. I was originally planning to get this in early May, but I got too caught up with my final weeks of school, and I graduated high school not too long ago, so I was kind of in a tight situation at that time. This video alone was a chore to make, mostly due because I was working with a lot of files and material for this video, so Vegas Pro would like freeze and crash a whole lot, and it was irritating, but I finally got past all of it. I also had to do a lot of retakes of voice lines because I'm not a very good commentator, so of course I would make a shit ton of mistakes and stuff. One final thing I have to say is that I'm going to be canceling this year's Q&A because I'm going to be pretty busy this specific summer because, you know, I just graduated fresh out of high school and I'm going to have a lot of shit to do, but I will do one next year, I think. With all that being said, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will get Spider-Man 2's video out as soon as I can.
You won't have a bite?
No thanks. Had a bite.